The hikers were enjoying what had been a serene afternoon in the forest when the sound cut through the air, sharp and chilling. It was unlike anything they had ever heard, neither human nor animal. An otherworldly wail that rose and fell like the wind but carried a raw, undeniable anguish. The group froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Even the birds seemed to stop singing, leaving the forest eerily silent except for the faint echo of the cry. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered, their voice barely audible over the tension. The sound came again, closer this time, sending a ripple of unease through the group. One of them, an experienced hiker, suggested it might be an injured animal, perhaps a deer caught in a trap. But another pointed out that no animal they knew could produce such a haunting, almost human-like sound. The debate didn't last long before they decided they couldn't ignore it. Their initial fear was outweighed by a shared sense of responsibility to investigate. But as they moved cautiously through the underbrush, the unsettling nature of the cry gnawed at them. When they reached a clearing and the cry fell silent, the group hesitated. The absence of the sound was almost worse than its presence. They called out into the emptiness, their voices bouncing back without reply. Just as they began to wonder if they'd imagined the whole thing, the cry returned louder, more desperate, and impossibly close. Something was out there, and whatever was needed help. Unable to continue on their own, the hikers returned to the trailhead and called the local rescue team. Their report was vague, even uncertain, as they struggled to describe the unnatural cry and the unsettling silence that followed it. Still, the rescue coordinator took them seriously. Forests were full of injured hikers, wild animals, and hidden ravines that could easily turn a simple outing into a tragedy. A cry for help, no matter how strange, was not something to be ignored. The rescue team assembled quickly. Jake, the team leader, was a seasoned veteran who had seen his fair share of strange calls. He listened patiently as the hikers relayed their story, his expression unreadable. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but even he couldn't deny the tremor of unease in their voices. He glanced at his team, Mia, his second-in-command, whose empathy often made her the heart of their operations, Liam, the tech-savvy rookie eager to prove himself, and Sarah, a no-nonsense survivalist who had little patience for anything she couldn't explain. Together, they packed their gear and set out, the hikers' directions guiding them into the denser, less traveled part of the forest. As the team ventured deeper, the atmosphere changed. The air felt heavier, the trees taller and more imposing, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the late afternoon sunlight. Every step seemed to amplify the silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. Then, just as the hikers had described, the cry returned. It was distant at first, but unmistakable mournful wail that sent a shiver down even Jake's spine. He paused, scanning the trees, his hand instinctively moving to the flashlight strapped to his belt despite the daylight. The sound guided them, growing louder and more erratic, like a beacon calling them forward. Mia tried to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees and disorienting their sense of direction. At one point, they stumbled across a small stream, its waters clear but oddly still, as if even the flow of nature had paused to listen. Jake knelt by the bank, inspecting faint footprints in the mud, small, barefoot, and human. He exchanged a glance with Mia, whose brow furrowed in concern. Children weren't unheard of in the forest, but these tracks were odd. They weren't recent, but they also weren't as weathered as one might expect in such a remote area. The cry sounded again, sharper this time, and Liam flinched visibly. That's not a kid, right?" he asked, trying to mask the quiver in his voice. Sarah shot him a withering look but didn't respond. Truth be told, even she couldn't identify the sound. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. The terrain grew uneven, forcing them to navigate over moss-covered rocks and twisted roots that seemed deliberately placed to trip them. Jake's compass, reliable as ever, began to falter, its needle spinning wildly before coming to rest in a direction that felt wrong. He didn't mention it, not wanting to alarm the team, but the unease was palpable. Finally, they reached a small clearing, where the cry abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as though the forest itself had been holding its breath. Jake raised a hand to signal the team to halt, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The shadows played tricks on his vision, but there was something or someone just out of sight. Mia, unable to shake the feeling they were being watched, called out gently, her voice carrying a note of reassurance. No response came, but as they stepped forward, they noticed something in the center of the clearing. A faint glimmer of light caught their attention, a small, glowing object partially obscured by the underbrush. Mia moved cautiously, her hand resting on the radio clipped to her vest. She crouched down, parting the foliage to reveal what looked like a child, no older than 6, sitting motionless on the forest floor. The child was thin, dirty, and clutching something in their arms, a stone tablet, smooth and polished, glowing faintly with an unearthly light. The team froze. The child's wide, hollow eyes stared back at them, unblinking and filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something they couldn't quite name. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she realized the child wasn't crying. They hadn't made a sound since the team entered the clearing. But then, where had the cries come from? Jake whispered for Mia to hold back, but she ignored him, taking a cautious step toward the child. The forest seemed to close in around them as she knelt, extending a hand. The child flinched but didn't move away, their grip tightening on the glowing tablet. The faint light reflected off their gaunt face, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the clearing. Mia's voice trembled as she spoke softly, trying to reassure the child. The forest remained silent, heavy with tension, as though waiting for something to happen. The child's silent presence lingered in their minds as they moved deeper into the forest, their sense of unease growing with every step. Jake led the way, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of a trail. Mia walked slightly behind him, her thoughts consumed by the child and the strange object they had been clutching. It wasn't just a piece of carved stone. It seemed alive, pulsing faintly as if it were breathing along with the forest. The others, Liam and Sarah, followed in tense silence, their unease mirrored in the occasional sideways glance they exchanged. The air in the forest seemed heavier now, as though the trees themselves were pressing in on them. Sunlight barely filtered through the canopy above, casting long, distorted shadows across their path. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig felt amplified, making even the most mundane sounds unnerving. The cry they had followed earlier had stopped entirely, leaving only the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the undergrowth. But the silence didn't feel empty. It was alive with an unseen tension, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting. They came upon an area where the trees were marked with strange symbols, carved deep into the bark. The markings were crude yet deliberate, spiraling upward in patterns that seemed too precise to be natural. Jake paused, running his fingers over the grooves of one such mark. The edges were rough, as if the carving had been done hastily, but the symbols themselves were alien, nothing like the wildlife warning signs or territorial markers they'd seen in other parts of the forest. "Do you think these are warnings?" Mia asked quietly, her voice breaking the stillness. Jake didn't respond immediately. He glanced back at her, his face unreadable. "Could be. Or someone's idea of a prank," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. He looked again at the symbols, as if they might rearrange themselves into something more familiar. "Let's keep moving." They pressed on, their movements careful and deliberate. As they walked, the terrain began to shift subtly. The ground grew softer underfoot, damp and spongy, and a faint mist began to creep in around their ankles. The trees were different here, older, their trunks gnarled and twisted as though they'd grown in pain. Vines coiled around them like veins, some of them pulsing faintly, a movement so subtle that Sarah was the first to notice. "Did that move?" she asked, pointing at one of the vines. The group stopped, their eyes following her gesture. The vine remained still now, inert and harmless, but none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched not by animals or people, but by the forest itself. Mia felt it most acutely. There was a presence here, something ancient and observing. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if the forest were aware of them, assessing their every move. Her fingers brushed against her radio, a reflexive motion for reassurance, though she doubted it would be of much use this deep into the wilderness. Liam, lagging slightly behind, adjusted the settings on his GPS device. "I don't understand," he muttered, mostly to himself, but loud enough for the others to hear. "The coordinates don't make sense. It's like the signal's bouncing, but there's no interference out here." Jake shot him a glance. "Equipment glitches happen. Just stay focused." Liam nodded, but his unease was evident. He double-checked the device again, the numbers on the screen flickering erratically. It wasn't just a GPS, though. His compass had been behaving strangely, too, its needle spinning before settling in directions that didn't match their map. He didn't say anything more, not wanting to seem paranoid, but the pit in his stomach grew heavier. The mist thickened as they ventured further, clinging to their boots and wrapping around their legs like invisible hands. It muffled their footsteps, making it harder to judge distances. Occasionally, they thought they heard faint noises, soft whispers just on the edge of hearing, indistinct and fleeting. Each time, they stopped to listen, but the whispers disappeared as quickly as they'd come. Then, just as suddenly as the whispers began, the cry returned. This time, it was louder and more piercing, as though whatever or whoever was making the sound was closer than ever. It reverberated through the trees, seeming to come from every direction at once. Mia instinctively turned toward the source, but the direction wasn't clear. It was as though the forest itself was throwing the sound back at them, distorting it into something even more unnerving. Jake raised a hand to signal them to stop. "Everyone stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. He scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as he searched for any movement. The cry came again, and this time, it was accompanied by a faint rustling, like leaves brushing together in a breeze that didn't exist. Sarah stepped closer to the group, her usual composure replaced by a quiet alertness. "This isn't an animal," she said, her tone flat but carrying an edge of unease. "No animal sounds like that." Jake didn't respond, his focus still on the trees. "Keep your eyes open," he said, motioning for them to move forward. As they continued, they stumbled upon a small clearing. The mist seemed to retreat here, curling at the edges of the open space, like it was afraid to enter. In the center of the clearing was an odd arrangement of stones, stacked in a way that seemed both natural and deliberate. The stones were covered in moss and lichen, but faint carvings were visible beneath the growth symbols that matched the ones they'd seen earlier on the trees. "What is this place?" Liam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. The clearing felt wrong, like a wound in the forest. Mia knelt near the stones, brushing away some of the moss to get a better look at the carvings. As her fingers traced the patterns, a sudden chill ran through her, as though the air around her had dropped several degrees. Before anyone could say anything, the cry came again, louder than ever, cutting through the clearing like a knife. It was so close now that they could feel it in their chests, vibrating through their bones. But even as the sound filled the air, there was no sign of its source. No movement, no figure, just the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in on them. Jake's jaw tightened. "We're not alone," he said, his voice grim. For the first time, the team began to question whether they had made a mistake coming this far. Mia's hand hovered hesitantly over the child, who remained perfectly still, their small frame shivering slightly as they clutched the glowing artifact tighter to their chest. The faint light from the object pulsed in a rhythm that felt almost alive, casting an eerie glow on the child's hollowed face. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't peaceful, it was dense, oppressive, as though the forest itself was watching, waiting for their next move. Jake motioned for Mia to pull back, but she shook her head and took a small step forward, speaking in a low, soothing voice. "It's okay. We're here to help." The child's gaze flicked toward her but stayed unfocused, as if they were looking through her rather than at her. Their lips parted slightly, but no words came out, only shallow, rasping breaths that made Mia's chest tighten with worry. It wasn't just fear that gripped the child. There was something else, something deeper, primal, like they were caught in a memory too vast for their small frame to hold. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "This doesn't feel right. We need to move. Now," she muttered, her eyes darting to the surrounding trees. Liam, visibly shaken, nodded in agreement, his knuckles white as he gripped the strap of his pack. Jake crouched beside Mia, his eyes narrowing on the object in the child's arms. It wasn't just an artifact. It was something otherworldly. The smooth surface of the stone glimmered faintly, etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when viewed from different angles. The carvings weren't random. They felt deliberate, almost like a language trying to communicate something just out of reach. "Kid," Jake said, his voice softer than usual but still firm. "What's that you've got there?" He reached out slowly, but the child flinched violently, clutching the artifact tighter and letting out a guttural sound, a sound that wasn't a scream but carried the weight of one. The noise echoed unnaturally through the clearing, reverberating off the trees and sending a shiver down everyone's spine. Even the shadows seemed to ripple in response, as if they, too, were alive. Mia put a hand on Jake's arm, shaking her head. "Don't. They're terrified. We can't just grab it." She turned back to the child, lowering her voice. "It's okay. We're not going to hurt you. We just want to help." Slowly, she extended her hand, palm up, not toward the artifact, but toward the child, an offering of trust. For a moment, it seemed to work. The child's grip on the object loosened slightly, their eyes flickering to Mia's hand before darting back to the artifact. But just as quickly, their body tensed again, and the faint glow of the stone intensified. A low hum began to emanate from the artifact, a sound that started as a whisper but quickly grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the air. The hum wasn't random. It felt intentional, like a signal being sent out. Liam took a step back, his voice trembling. "What the hell is that thing?" "It's reacting to us." Before anyone could respond, the artifact pulsed, and a wave of light erupted from its surface. It wasn't blinding, but it was overwhelming, washing over the team and illuminating the clearing in a surreal, shifting glow. For a split second, the world around them changed. The forest disappeared, replaced by fleeting images, tall, gleaming structures that stretched toward a vibrant sky, bustling streets filled with figures that looked almost human but not quite. The air was alive with color and sound, a harmony that felt impossibly distant, yet achingly familiar. And then it all collapsed. The gleaming structures crumbled, the vibrant sky darkened, and the streets were overtaken by a wild, consuming forest. The trees grew rapidly, their roots tearing through stone and metal, reclaiming everything in sight. The vision ended abruptly, plunging them back into the clearing. Everyone staggered, gasping for breath as the light faded. Mia was the first to regain her composure, her hands trembling as she steadied herself. Did everyone see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded grimly, his jaw clenched. "It wasn't just a hallucination," he said. "That thing showed us something." "But what?" The child let out a small, pitiful sound, drawing their attention back. They had curled into themselves, clutching the artifact tightly once more, their bodies shaking violently. The light from the stone had dimmed but still pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. Mia knelt again, her voice gentle but urgent. Hey, it's okay. You're safe. Can you tell us what that was? Can you speak?" The child didn't respond, but they raised a trembling hand, pointing toward the trees. Mia followed their gaze and saw nothing at first, just the dense forest, shrouded in mist. But as she squinted, she noticed something unusual. A faint trail of glowing symbols leading deeper into the woods, identical to the ones carved into the artifact. Jake saw it too, his expression darkening. "We're not alone out here," he muttered. "That thing, whatever it ice, it's leading us somewhere." Sarah crossed her arms, her tone sharp. "And we're just going to follow it. This whole place feels wrong. That thing is dangerous, and we don't even know what it is. We can't just leave them here," Mia snapped, gesturing to the child. "They need us. And if this artifact is connected to whatever's out there, we need to figure out what's going on. We owe it to them." Liam hesitated, glancing between the glowing trail and the child. What if this is a warning? What if we're not supposed to follow it? Mia's eyes softened as she looked back at the child. If this is a warning, then we need to understand it. Otherwise, what's the point? Reluctantly, Jake agreed, motioning for the team to prepare to move. The child, still clutching the artifact, allowed Mia to lift them gently. They weighed almost nothing, their small frame a reminder of how fragile they were. The glow of the artifact seemed to pulse faintly in time with their breathing, as though the two were somehow connected. As they followed the glowing trail, the air grew heavier, the mist thicker, and the symbols brighter. The forest felt even more alive now, each step drawing them deeper into its grasp. Shadows shifted in their periphery, and the faint hum of the artifact seemed to sync with the rhythm of the forest, as though it were part of the same living organism. The trail led them to a clearing unlike any they had seen before. In the center stood a massive stone structure, partially buried under centuries of moss and vines. It was ancient but unmistakably man-made, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols as the artifact. The child stirred in Mia's arms, their gaze fixed on the structure with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. The artifact pulsed again, brighter this time, and the hum grew louder, resonating with the stone. The air vibrated with energy, and the forest seemed to close in around them, as though it were bracing for something. Jake stepped forward cautiously, his voice low. "Whatever this is, we're in the middle of it now." The child turned their gaze to Mia, their lips moving silently, forming a word that no one could hear, but that everyone felt deep in their bones. "Listen." The ruins loomed ahead, their ancient stones half consumed by the relentless growth of the forest. Vines crawled over the structure like veins, gripping it as though the forest had been trying to reclaim it for centuries. The air was thick and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of their throats. The child in Mia's arms stirred slightly, their hollow eyes fixed on the ruins with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The artifact in their grasp pulsed faintly, casting an eerie light that illuminated the intricate carvings etched into the stone. The team approached cautiously, their boots crunching softly against the moss-covered ground. Jake was the first to reach the structure, his hand brushing against the smooth, cold stone. The carvings were unlike anything he'd ever seen. They spiraled and looped in patterns that seemed almost mathematical, yet there was something organic about them, as if they grew naturally from the stone. He traced one with his finger, only to pull back as a faint warmth radiated from it, a sensation that lingered long after his hand left the surface. "This isn't just old," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder at the others. "It's ancient." Mia adjusted her grip on the child, who had gone silent but alert, their small hands still clutching the artifact as though it were an extension of their body. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, a sense that they were standing in the presence of something monumental. Sarah circled the perimeter of the structure, her eyes scanning for signs of danger, but even she couldn't hide her unease. There was no sign of animal tracks or human interference, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to emanate from the ruins themselves. Liam, unable to contain his curiosity, pulled out his camera and began taking pictures of the carvings. The flash illuminated details that were almost invisible to the naked eye, tiny, precise etchings that seemed to depict scenes of a world both alien and eerily familiar. Figures stood in symmetrical formations, their elongated forms suggesting a species that was not entirely human. Above them, a massive tree spread its branches, its roots intertwining with the figures as if they were part of the same organism. "What do you think this means?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia didn't answer. Her eyes were drawn to a section of the carvings that depicted what looked like a city-tall spires and intricate bridges, all radiating out from the base of the massive tree. The detail was extraordinary, down to the tiny windows carved into the buildings. But something about the scene was unsettling. The city wasn't static. It appeared to change as she shifted her perspective, the buildings crumbling and the tree's roots spreading outward to consume them. Jake noticed it too. "It's like they're telling a story," he said, his voice tinged with unease. "A story that doesn't end well." As if in response, the artifact pulsed brighter, its hum growing louder. The child turned their gaze toward the ruins, their lips parting slightly as though they wanted to speak. Mia leaned closer, her heart pounding. "What is it? Can you tell us?" The child raised a trembling hand and pointed toward an opening in the structure, a dark, gaping entrance half obscured by vines. The gesture was deliberate, almost commanding, and the team exchanged uneasy glances. Jake hesitated, his instincts screaming that this was a bad idea. But the pull of the ruins was undeniable. They had come this far. Turning back now wasn't an option. The entrance was narrow, forcing them to move single file as they stepped into the darkness. The air inside was cooler, carrying a faint, earthy scent that mixed with the metallic tang they'd noticed earlier. The walls were lined with more carvings, their glow faint but steady, providing just enough light to see by. The hum of the artifact seemed to resonate with the space, creating a low, vibrating sound that set their nerves on edge. Mia stayed close to Jake, the child still in her arms. The further they went, the heavier the air felt, as though the weight of the structure itself was pressing down on them. Liam followed close behind, his camera clicking softly as he documented everything. Sarah brought up the rear, her hand resting on the hilt of the knife strapped to her belt, her eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The tunnel opened into a large chamber, and the team stopped in their tracks, their breaths catching as they took in the sight before them. The chamber was vast, its domed ceiling rising high above them, supported by massive stone pillars carved with the same intricate patterns they'd seen outside. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it rested another artifact larger than the one the child held, its surface glowing with a steady, golden light. The child stirred in Mia's arms, their gaze fixed on the pedestal. Without warning, they reached out, their small hand trembling as they pointed toward it. The hum of the artifact in their grasp grew louder, and the light from its surface began to flicker, syncing with the glow of the larger artifact. What's happening?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the larger artifact emitted a pulse of light, brighter than anything they'd seen so far. The room was suddenly filled with images floating holograms that seemed to rise from the walls and the pedestal itself. They showed the same city they'd seen in the carvings, but this time it was alive. Figures moved through the streets, their elongated forms elegant and fluid. The massive tree at the center of the city glowed with an inner light, its branches reaching toward the sky. But the scene quickly shifted. The tree's light began to dim, its branches wilting as the city around it crumbled. The figures scattered, their movements frantic, their once graceful forms now twisted with fear. The forest began to overtake the city, its roots tearing through stone and metal, consuming everything in its path. The final image was of the tree, now dark and lifeless, its branches drooping under the weight of its own decay. The light faded, and the chamber was silent once more. The team stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. Mia looked down at the child, whose expression was unreadable. "Is that your home?" she asked softly. The child didn't answer, but their grip on the artifact tightened. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. "This isn't just ruins. This is history, a warning." Sarah's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. "A warning for what? That whatever happened to them could happen to us." Jake nodded grimly. Maybe it's already happening." Before they could say anything more, the chamber began to tremble. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the light from the larger artifact began to flicker erratically. The child let out a small cry, their first sound since they'd found them, and Mia's heart clenched. "We need to get out of here," she said urgently. As they turned to leave, the walls of the chamber seemed to shift, the carvings glowing brighter and pulsing in time with the artifact. The air grew heavier, and the hum of the artifact reached a deafening pitch. The forest wasn't just alevite, was waking up. The chamber's vibrations grew stronger, shaking loose small fragments of stone that clattered to the ground. The hum from the artifact in the child's grasp had transformed into a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to ripple through the air, matching the tremors beneath their feet. The team hurried toward the tunnel, but as they moved, the light from the carvings on the walls intensified, casting sharp, shifting shadows that danced wildly around them. It felt as if the ruins themselves were alive, reacting to their presence in ways none of them could explain. Jake led the way, his jaw clenched, scanning the path ahead for signs of collapse. The tunnel seemed narrower now, the walls pressing in on them as though the ruins were trying to trap them. Behind him, Mia clutched the child tightly, her every step deliberate as she tried to shield them from the falling debris. Liam and Sarah brought up the rear, their breathing ragged as they hurried to keep up. The oppressive silence that had characterized the forest earlier was now replaced by a low, guttural sound that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't just the ruins that were shifting, the forest outside had begun to stir. Branches creaked, leaves rustled, and the faint sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush reached their ears, growing louder with every passing moment. They burst out of the tunnel into the open air. But the clearing was no longer the quiet, eerie space they had entered earlier. The mist had thickened, swirling around them in dense, unnatural patterns that seemed to block their view in all directions. The air was colder now, biting at their exposed skin, and the faint metallic tang that had been present before was stronger, almost suffocating. The glow from the artifact in the child's arms had dimmed, but its pulsing rhythm continued, steady and unrelenting. Jake's voice cut through the chaos. "We need to move, stay close, and keep your eyes on each other." They pushed forward, but the forest was no longer the same. Paths they had walked earlier were gone, replaced by dense thickets of vines and trees that seemed to have grown in seconds. The ground beneath their feet was soft and uneven, forcing them to navigate carefully to avoid tripping. The shadows around them shifted unnaturally, moving in ways that defied logic. It was as if the forest had become a living entity, responding to their presence with hostility. A sudden noise to their left, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping, made everyone freeze. Jake raised a hand, signaling for silence. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable rustle of something large moving through the trees. Mia tightened her grip on the child, her heart pounding in her chest. The child's eyes were wide, their body trembling as they clutched the artifact even tighter. Liam whispered, his voice barely audible, "What is that?" Jake didn't answer. His hand moved to the flashlight strapped to his belt, but as he flicked it on, the beam barely penetrated the swirling mist. The light seemed to bend and scatter, as though the fog itself were absorbing it. He took a cautious step forward, scanning the area for any sign of movement, but the forest remained unervingly still. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them trembled violently, throwing them off balance. Mia stumbled, clutching the child to her chest as Jake grabbed her arm to steady her. The tremor was brief but intense, and as it subsided, a deep, resonant growl echoed through the forest. It was low and guttural, carrying a primal menace that sent chills down their spines. Sarah unsheathed her knife, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. "We're not alone," she said, her voice low and steady. "Whatever's out here doesn't want us here." The growl came again, louder this time, and was joined by other sounds, whispers, faint but distinct, carried on the wind. They were unintelligible, a cacophony of voices overlapping and blending into an unsettling symphony. The forest felt alive in a way that was deeply unnatural, as though it were watching them, testing them, and preparing to strike. Jake motioned for the team to move, his voice calm but firm. "Keep moving. Don't stop for anything." They pressed on, their pace quickening despite the uneven terrain. The mist seemed to part just enough to reveal glimpses of the forest ahead, but every step felt like a gamble. The trees loomed larger now, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the vines underfoot were slick and treacherous. The noises around them grew louder, the whispers blending with the rustling of leaves and the creaking of branches. It was impossible to tell where the sounds were coming from. They seemed to echo from all directions, closing in on them like a predator circling its prey. The tension was suffocating, and every nerve in Mia's body screamed for her to run. But she forced herself to stay calm for the child's sake. A sudden flash of movement to their right drew their attention. Something darted between the trees too fast to make out, but large enough to be unmistakably real. Jake stopped in his tracks, his hand instinctively reaching for the flare gun at his side. "Did anyone else see that?" he asked, his voice tight. Before anyone could answer, the creature reappeared, this time on their left. It was still too quick to identify, but the sound of its move meant a heavy, deliberate rustling sent a clear message. They were being hunted. Jake fired the flare, the bright red light cutting through the mist and illuminating the forest for a brief moment. In that instant, they caught a glimpse of a massive, shadowy figure with glowing eyes that burned like embers. It moved on all fours, its elongated limbs unnaturally thin yet powerful. The sight of it was enough to freeze them in place, their minds struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. The creature let out a bone-chilling screech, a sound that reverberated through the forest and made their ears ring. It was a cry of dominance, a warning, and a challenge all at once. The team broke into a run, their instincts overriding any sense of strategy. The forest blurred around them as they sprinted, the mist whipping past their faces and the sound of the creature's pursuit growing louder behind them. Mia held the child close, her legs burning as she pushed herself to keep up with Jake. Liam stumbled but quickly regained his footing, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Sarah stayed at the back, her knife drawn, ready to defend the group if it came to that. The ground suddenly gave way beneath Liam, and he fell with a cry, his body sliding down a steep embankment. Jake shouted his name, skidding to a halt and peering over the edge. The mist obscured his view, but Liam's voice came faintly from below. "I'm okay. Just keep going." Jake hesitated, torn between helping his teammate and ensuring the safety of the rest of the group. Mia grabbed his arm. "We have to keep moving. He'll catch up." Reluctantly, Jake nodded, and they continued their frantic escape. The creature's screeches grew fainter as they put distance between themselves and the embankment, but the forest hostility didn't relent. The vines underfoot seemed to writhe, tangling around their boots and slowing their progress. The trees closed in tighter, their branches forming barriers that forced them to change course repeatedly. Finally, they burst into another clearing, this one bathed in a faint, ethereal glow. The artifact in the child's arms pulsed brighter, its hum rising in pitch. The forest seemed to recoil slightly, as though the artifact's presence was holding it at bay. They collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. For the first time since they'd entered the forest, there was a moment of stillness. But it wasn't relief that filled the air, it was a sense of uneasy anticipation, as though the forest was merely regrouping, preparing for its next move. The creature's presence was gone, but its memory lingered, etched into their minds as a reminder that they were far from safe. The clearing pulsed with an unearthly light, the artifact in the child's arms synchronizing perfectly with the faint glow emanating from the surrounding trees. The team sat in silence, catching their breath, their bodies aching from the relentless escape. Jake wiped sweat from his brow, his eyes fixed on the artifact, now radiating a steady, golden hue that bathed the clearing in an otherworldly warmth. It wasn't comforting, it was commanding, as though the object itself had decided this was where everything would culminate. Mia cradled the child, her heart racing not just from the exertion, but from the weight of the moment. The child's eyes were wide, their gaze locked on the artifact, and for the first time they looked calm. The fear that had gripped them since the group found them was gone, replaced by something almost serene, as though they had reached the place they were meant to be. The artifact's hum grew louder, resonating in a way that made the air vibrate, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble in response. Sarah broke the silence, her voice low and cautious. "What is it doing?" She stared at the artifact as though it might explode at any moment. Before anyone could answer, the artifact released a sudden pulse of light, brighter and sharper than anything they had seen before. The team shielded their eyes, but the child didn't flinch. Instead, they reached out, their small hand resting on the surface of the glowing stone. The pulse spread outward, washing over the clearing, and then the world shifted. The forest melted away, replaced by a vision so vivid it felt as though they were standing inside it. Around them stretched a sprawling city, its architecture impossibly elegant tall spires that glimmered like glass, bridges that arched gracefully over flowing rivers, and streets paved with stones that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. At the center of it all stood a massive tree, its roots anchoring it firmly into the earth, while its branches stretched high into the sky, their leaves glimmering with a soft, golden light. The air was filled with the hum of life, a harmony that resonated in their bones. And the figures moving through the city were unlike anything they had ever seen. The inhabitants were humanoid but taller and more slender, their movements fluid and deliberate, as if every step and gesture carried a purpose. Their skin glowed faintly, reflecting the light of the tree, and their eyes held an intelligence that felt ancient and unfathomable. They weren't just living, they were thriving, deeply connected to the world around them in a way that defied comprehension. But the harmony didn't last. The vision shifted, the vibrant colors dimming as the golden light of the tree began to fade. The figures in the city grew frantic, their movements no longer fluid but panicked. The rivers dried up, the shimmering streets cracked, and the elegant spires crumbled as the earth beneath them trembled. The tree, once the heart of the city, began to wither, its leaves falling in a cascade of dimming light. The roots, once strong and steady, curled inward as though retreating from the world it had nurtured. Then came the forest. It surged forward, relentless and unforgiving, its roots tearing through the remains of the city, consuming the ruins in an unstoppable wave of green. The figures fought against it, but they were no match for the force of nature reclaiming what had been lost. In the final moments of the vision, the tree stood alone, its last leaf falling as the forest overtook it entirely. The vision ended abruptly, leaving the team back in the clearing, the artifact still glowing faintly, but its hum now softer, almost mournful. The child let out a small sigh, their hand dropping from the artifact's surface. For a moment, no one spoke, the weight of what they had seen settling over them like a suffocating fog. Jake was the first to break the silence. "That wasn't just a vision," he said, his voice rough. "That was real. That was history." Mia nodded, her eyes still locked on the artifact. "It's a warning," she said softly. "Whatever happened to them, it could happen again." Liam's hands trembled as he clutched his camera, though he knew it hadn't captured the vision. "How could a civilization like that just vanish?" he asked, his voice cracking. "They were advanced, connected to everything. How did they let it all fall apart?" The child shifted in Mia's arms, their small voice breaking through the tension. "Greed," they whispered, the word barely audible but carrying an undeniable weight. It was the first word they had spoken, and it sent a chill through the group. The child looked at Mia, their eyes filled with a sadness far too deep for someone so young. "They forgot!" Jake's expression hardened, his mind racing. "Forgot what?" The child didn't answer, but they pointed to the artifact, their finger tracing one of the glowing symbols on its surface. It shifted under their touch, rearranging itself into a pattern that none of them recognized. Mia stared at it, her breath catching as she realized it wasn't just a symbol, it was a map. The artifact pulsed again, and the forest around them responded. The mist began to swirl, forming shapes that resembled the figures from the vision. They moved gracefully, silently, before dissolving into the air. The trees trembled, their branches creaking as though speaking in a language the team couldn't understand. The message was clear. They had been shown the past, but the responsibility to prevent it from happening again lay squarely on their shoulders. Jake exhaled slowly, his voice steady but heavy with determination. If that's what they wanted us to see, then we can't ignore it. This isn't just about them, it's about us. Sarah shook her head, her voice sharp. And what exactly are we supposed to do with this? Tell people we saw visions in the forest, that an artifact showed us the end of a civilization no one even knows existed? They'll think we're insane. Mia looked at the child, then back at the artifact. It doesn't matter if they believe us, she said firmly. What matters is that we don't forget, that we don't let it happen again. The clearing grew still once more, the glow of the artifact fading until it was nothing but a faint shimmer. The child's eyes closed, their small body finally relaxing as if their purpose had been fulfilled. Mia held them close, her heart heavy but resolute. They didn't have all the answers, but they had seen enough to know that their choices, and the choices of those who came after them, would determine whether the vision remained a warning or became their future. The clearing felt eerily still, as if the entire forest had paused to observe them. The artifact's glow had dimmed to a faint flicker, and the child had fallen into an exhausted, silent state in Mia's arms. For a brief moment, the team stood frozen, the weight of what they'd seen pressing heavily on their minds. Jake was the first to move, his voice low and urgent. "We can't stay here. Whatever gave us that vision, it's not done with us. We need to get out of this forest." The mist that had seemed to retreat slightly during the vision began creeping back, curling around their ankles like living tendrils. The air grew colder, sharp and biting, and the faint sound of rustling leaves returned, though no wind stirred the trees. It was as if the forest itself had awakened, its attention fully fixed on the intruders who had dared to uncover its secrets. Mia adjusted her grip on the child, her arms aching from the strain, but refusing to let go. She could feel their small, steady breaths against her chest, a reminder that whatever had drawn them here, the child was at the center of it all. Liam checked his camera, desperate for any sign that he'd captured the vision, but the screen was blank, save for the earlier photographs of the carvings. He cursed under his breath, slinging the camera back over his shoulder as he prepared to move. Sarah had already taken position at the edge of the clearing, scanning the trees for signs of movement. "We don't know what's out there," she said, her voice clipped. "But whatever it is, it's been watching us. It knows we're here." Jake nodded, his expression grim. "Stay close. No one strays from the group." They plunged back into the forest, the terrain unfamiliar despite having traveled through it earlier. The paths they had taken before were gone, replaced by dense thickets and towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Every step felt like a struggle, the ground soft and uneven, and the vines beneath their feet seemed to shift and curl, as if trying to trip them. The forest hostility grew more palpable with each passing moment. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate, coming from multiple directions at once. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, darting between the trees too quickly to identify. The whispers that had haunted them earlier returned, louder and more distinct, though still unintelligible. It was as if the forest itself was speaking, its voice layered and ancient, full of anger and sorrow. Mia glanced at Jake, her voice tight. "Do you think it's trying to stop us? Or scare us away? Does it matter?" Jake replied, his tone sharper than intended. "Either way, we're getting out of here." A sudden snap of a branch to their left made everyone freeze. The sound was too close, too deliberate to be random. Jake raised his flare gun, his finger hovering over the trigger, his eyes scanning the darkness. The tension was suffocating, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours as they waited for anything to emerge. Then it came. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, but it wasn't the massive, predatory creature they had glimpsed earlier. It was smaller, humanoid, its form distorted and grotesque, with elongated limbs and hollow, glowing eyes that burned like embers. It moved slowly, almost cautiously, its head tilting as it regarded them with an unsettling curiosity. Jake fired the flare. The bright, red light illuminated the forest, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the trees. The creature recoiled, letting out a piercing shriek that made the air vibrate. It wasn't alone. From the darkness, more figures emerged, their movements erratic and inhuman, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. "Run!" Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The team broke into a sprint, the forest blurring around them as they pushed forward. The creatures pursued them, their screeches filling the air, echoing off the trees in a disorienting cacophony. Mia struggled to keep her footing, her arms burning as she clutched the child tightly. Sarah stayed close behind, her knife drawn, ready to defend them if the creatures got too close. The terrain grew steeper, the ground rising and falling unpredictably, forcing them to navigate around jagged rocks and gnarled roots that seemed to reach out to snare them. Liam stumbled, catching himself at the last moment, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the creatures gaining on them, their movements unnatural, almost spider-like as they crawled and leapt through the trees. "We're not going to make it like this," Liam shouted, panic lacing his voice. Jake gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He knew he had to buy them time, but the odds were stacked against them. His gaze fell on a narrow gap between two massive trees ahead, the space barely wide enough for them to slip through. "Head for the gap! Go!" The team surged forward, squeezing through the narrow opening one by one. Jake was the last to pass, his shoulders scraping against the rough bark as he turned and fired another flare at the pursuing creatures. The light exploded in the darkness, momentarily halting their advance, but Jake knew it wouldn't last. He ducked through the gap, joining the others on the other side. The terrain changed abruptly, the dense trees giving way to a rocky slope that descended sharply into a ravine. The sound of rushing water reached their ears, faint but unmistakable, a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. Jake pointed toward the ravine. "Follow the water. It'll lead us out." They scrambled down the slope, the loose rocks shifting beneath their feet. The creatures didn't hesitate, their glowing eyes appearing at the edge of the slope as they followed with unsettling ease. Mia slipped, her ankle twisting painfully as she fell to one knee, but she forced herself to stand, the child clinging to her with surprising strength. The rushing water grew louder, the sound cutting through the screeches of the creatures. They reached the bottom of the ravine and saw a narrow stream winding through the rocks, its surface shimmering faintly in the dim light. The team didn't hesitate, splashing into the icy water and following its path downstream. The creatures stopped at the edge of the stream, their glowing eyes fixed on the team as if debating whether to follow. The water seemed to act as a barrier, its current faintly glowing in a way that mirrored the artifact's light. One of the creatures reached out tentatively, its elongated fingers hovering above the surface, but it recoiled with a hiss, retreating into the shadows. Jake slowed, his breath heavy, his eyes never leaving the creatures as the team continued downstream. The tension lingered, the presence of the forest still oppressive, but the creatures did not pursue. They stood at the edge of the stream, their eyes burning like embers, watching as the team disappeared into the distance. When the forest finally thinned, the first rays of dawn pierced through the trees, casting the team in a pale golden light. The artifact in the child's arms grew dim, its hum fading into silence. The oppressive weight of the forest lifted, replaced by the quiet stillness of the morning. They had made it out, but the memory of what they had seen and what they had escaped would haunt them forever. The sunlight filtering through the trees felt like a rebirth. After the suffocating darkness of the forest, the brightness and warmth carried an almost surreal quality. The team staggered out into the open, their breaths shallow, their bodies aching. The forest's oppressive weight had lifted, but its presence lingered, a constant reminder of the impossible events they had witnessed. They stopped at the trailhead, looking back at the dense line of trees that marked the boundary between what they knew of the world and the unfathomable mystery they had encountered. Jake dropped his pack to the ground, his legs barely supporting him. He glanced at Mia, who was still holding the child. The boy seemed calm now, his small fingers still clutching the artifact, its glow barely perceptible. Liam leaned against a nearby post, his camera hanging limply from his neck, as if its presence was now irrelevant. Sarah crouched near the edge of the path, staring back into the forest, her knife still clutched in her hand. No one spoke for a long time. When Jake finally broke the silence, his voice was low, heavy with exhaustion and disbelief. "We made it out." He looked at each of them, his words hanging in the air like a question. "But what now? What do we do with this?" Mia adjusted the child in her arms, her grip protective. "We can't just walk away. Not after what we saw. Not after what we know." Her voice carried the weight of conviction, but there was a tremor beneath it, a flicker of doubt that echoed through all of them. Liam slumped against the post, shaking his head. "And who's going to believe us? Even if I write about it, even if I show the pictures, people will just say it's a hoax, a story to sell headlines. No one's going to listen." Sarah stood, her expression hard. "It doesn't matter if they believe us. What matters is that we don't forget, that we don't let this happen again." She gestured toward the forest, her voice sharp. That place, it wasn't just trying to scare us. It was testing us. And if someone else goes in there with the wrong intentions, they won't come back. Jake rubbed a hand over his face, the lines of fatigue etched deeply into his features. "So what do we do? We can't keep this quiet forever, and we can't leave the artifact out in the open." Mia looked down at the child, their face calm but distant, as though they were still caught in the echoes of the vision they'd shared. "We keep it safe," she said softly, "until we figure out how to share this without it being used against everything it's meant to protect." The child shifted slightly, their small hand brushing against the surface of the artifact. The faint glow pulsed once, almost like a heartbeat, and the air seemed to hum briefly before falling silent again. They turned their gaze to Mia, their voice quiet but steady. "It's not just for us. It's for them." Jake frowned. "Them? Who do you mean?" The child looked toward the forest, their expression unreadable. "Everyone." The simplicity of their words struck something deep within the group. The vision had shown them the downfall of an entire civilization, a story of greed, neglect, and loss. It wasn't just a warning for them as individuals. It was a lesson meant for humanity. The forest hadn't just let them leave. It had entrusted them with its message. Over the following days, the group stayed together, unable to fully part ways after what they had experienced. They worked in quiet determination, documenting everything they could remember, sketching the symbols they had seen, and recording every detail of the vision. Liam pored over his photos, desperately hoping that one of them might hold proof, but all he found were fragments, carvings, glowing symbols, and blurred shapes that hinted at the creatures they had fled from. Jake spent hours poring over maps, trying to understand the geography of the forest and the placement of the ruins. "It's like the forest doesn't want to exist on paper," he muttered one evening. "No matter how I map it out, it doesn't make sense. Trails that should connect don't. It's almost like it's alive." Mia, meanwhile, focused on the child. She felt an inexplicable bond with them, a sense of responsibility that went beyond their survival. The boy spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried a weight that defied his age. He spoke of remembering, of listening, of learning from the past. Though his sentences were fragmented, they painted a picture of a world that had once thrived in harmony before it had been consumed by its own ambition. One night, as they sat together by a small fire outside the ranger station, Jake posed a question that had been haunting all of them. "Do you think the forest will ever let someone else in?" Sarah shook her head, not without a purpose. "It let us in because of the child, because of the artifact. Without them, I don't think anyone would have made it this far." Mia looked down at the boy, who was staring into the flames, his face illuminated by their soft glow. "And if they do?" she asked. "If someone else finds their way in?" The boy turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet certainty. "Then they'll have to remember, too." In the years that followed, each member of the team carried the weight of the experience in their own way. Liam wrote articles and essays, presenting the story as fiction, but weaving in the truths he hoped would reach the right people. His words carried a warning, subtle but persistent, urging readers to respect the natural world and its balance. Sarah joined environmental organizations, using her skills to protect remote areas from exploitation. She never spoke of the forest directly, but her actions were driven by the lessons she had learned there. Jake became a recluse, spending his time mapping uncharted regions and warning adventurers about the dangers of going too far into the unknown. Though he rarely mentioned the forest, his advice always carried an edge of urgency, as if he were trying to shield others from the mistakes of the past. Mia devoted herself to the child, who grew slowly, their wisdom far exceeding their years. They seemed to carry the memory of the forest within them, their words often cryptic but profound. They spoke of balance, of listening to the world, and of the importance of humility. Mia knew she was raising more than a child. She was raising the voice of a forgotten world. The artifact remained hidden, its glow fading but never extinguishing entirely. It was a relic of a past long gone but not forgotten, a reminder of what could be lost if humanity failed to learn. Occasionally, the boy would touch it, and the faint hum would return, a soft, steady rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the forest. One day, as they walked together in a quiet meadow far from the forest, the boy stopped and pointed to a young sapling growing in the shade of a larger tree. "It starts here," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of generations. Small but strong, Mia knelt beside him, her heart heavy but hopeful. "And what do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. The boy turned to her, his expression calm and knowing.